All right, Shalom family, and welcome back to the Semitic Jew channel. This is the second production in my ongoing examination of European American chattel slavery and manifest destiny in order to demonstrate how both systems did not operate under the authority of the laws of God, but operated in direct opposition to it. So this evening, I'm not going to appeal based on your emotions, and I'm not going to appeal to you based on political correctness. What I want to do is I want to argue legally, okay? I want to argue as if I were a law student, okay? But not just any law, not human law. We're talking about the Hebraic law, the law that doesn't come from modern day Jewish people, that doesn't come from Europeans. This law comes directly from God Himself. So we're talking about divine laws here. Okay. So I'm going to appeal to you on the basis of those legal terms only. All right. Because if a system violates those laws explicitly, then it cannot be of God. And if it requires the distortion of scripture to survive for 400 years, then it operates under another authority. And then I'm going to leave it to you to determine who that authority is after this lecture tonight. Okay. So the title of this lecture is Common Rebuttels Used to Justify Chattel Slavery and Why They Collapse Under Hebrew Law, Logic, and Scripture. So, what this lecture will do is we're going to examine one by one the most common defenses used to justify European American chattel slavery, colonial expansion under manifest destiny, racial hierarchy framed as providential, and we're going to test those defenses against the three standards: the Hebrew law, or the statutes that God gave the Hebrews; biblical logic, which is um, covenant covenant structure, how the covenant was structured, and its legal consistency. And then lastly, I'm going to look at the historical reality. Like we're going to look at some actual laws and documented practices. Okay. So if a claim survives those three tests, then I don't have a problem in acknowledging it. But if it fails, then I'm going to say so very clearly. Okay. So I want to begin with, like I did before, with a premise, if you will. Okay. Because the Torah, or the laws of God, define justice. They don't define how to establish a new empire. Okay. The scriptures define righteousness, not nation states. Okay. And no religious tradition has the authority to override explicit commands, whether it be Christianity, Christendom, modern day Judaism, or any other religion. They don't have the authority to override explicit commands by God. Okay. If kidnapping is a capital crime under the laws of God, if unpaid labor is condemned by the prophets, if human beings belong to God alone, then any system violating those commands cannot be called biblical. I feel like that's absolutely common sense in my mind, because again, like I said, I study logic, I'm a logician, and so I hope that as you interact with me, that this this type of thinking will also rub off on you. Okay. Now, again, this lecture will demonstrate that the most common rebuttals that I'm going to address, these are some rebuttals that I heard after I did the first lecture, inevitably, my comment section. Okay. So um, I'm going to show how those rebuttals are used to defend chattel slavery, and um, I'm going to show how they depend on selective reading, and how they depend on things like colonial theology, and how they depend on ignoring legal structure. Okay. And when examined carefully, they collapse under their own weight. But you have to think critically about the traditions of these American Europeans. Okay. You have to think very critically about what is being said about history. Okay, so this is not to shame people. I'm not trying to attack anybody, because that's not what logic is. Logic is about finding the truth. So I'm just here to examine the systems that they put out there as the Holy Grail, and those systems are judged by law. So let's begin. All right, so the first rebuttal is usually the Bible allows slavery. And the claim that they make is that slavery exists in the Bible, therefore it is permitted. Okay, so this argument assumes that the presence of a term in Scripture equals moral endorsement of any later institution using the same word. So if a word appears, then they're like, hey, look, the Bible prescribes it. So the flaw is linguistic and it's legal, because the Hebrew term translated as slave in many English Bibles is aved. That term describes a servant, a laborer, a royal official, a covenant subordinate. It does not automatically describe race based property ownership. Even in Genesis chapter 41, verse 12, Joseph is referred to that. Joseph, it is used of Joseph in that context. And then it's also used of Moses in Deuteronomy 34:5. So Moses and Joseph are both called that same term, right? Because again, that slave term in the Hebrew Bible is usually referred to as a servant, a laborer, a royal official, or a covenant subordinate. Okay. The word describes a relational service, not racial chattel, not an animal, not 3/5 human. And the Atlantic system, by contrast, legally defined enslaved Hebrews as property, transferable assets, some would say in modern vernacular, farm equipment, inheritable status through birth, permanently bound, regardless of conduct or covenant. That does not sound like the Hebrew customs whatsoever. That structure is not described anywhere in the laws of God. All right. So the presence of regulated labor in ancient Israel does not equal authorization of modern chattel slavery. Legal category matters. It matters to God. The next one, Hebrew law. Okay. Servitude is not the logical equivalence of human ownership. The law regulated labor relationships, but it never grants absolute ownership over human beings. Exodus 20, chapter 10. Thou nor thy servant shall do any work on the Sabbath. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the slaves worked. They did not rest on the Sabbath. So a servant receives Sabbath protection. Where was that in America? You can't even keep the Sabbath today. If your employer says that you work on the Sabbath, you will work or you will lose your job. So you can't say that, oh, somehow back when things were a lot more rigorous and a lot more demonstrous, that they were able to practice the Sabbath. It makes no sense. Exodus 21:26-27. If a master causes permanent injury, the servant goes free. So someone would say, "Oh, there's a range. You could beat them if they weren't working." That's not what that says. If you caused a permanent injury, the servant goes free. Deuteronomy 23:15-16. An escaped servant must not be returned. So those protections are incompatible with owning property, right? If a man's sheep ran off, you would have to return that. That's that man's sheep. That's how you know that they were treated like cattle and not treated as human beings. Under Roman law, property had no legal standing. Under Roman law. Under American slave codes, enslaved persons could not sue, could not testify, or claim bodily autonomy. You were owned as property. That's what chattel slavery is. Whether you go to the left, to the right, or north, north, south, east, or west, like a mule. You were told to go where, when. You had no humanness whatsoever. Under God's laws, bodily injury triggered emancipation, which means it would have occurred long before 1865, according to them, if they were keeping the laws of God. So that distinction is structural. It's not cosmetic. It's not surface level. Okay. Moreover, God regulates service. Chattel slavery institutionalized ownership. So those are not the same types of systems. And so, as I mentioned in Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 24:7, kidnapping is a capital crime. Exodus 21:16 states that he that stealeth a man and selleth him, he shall surely be put to death, which means every enslaver, whether they be African Hamites who sold us into slavery, or whether they be the white Portuguese or the white Spanish, because again, like I mentioned, it's well documented we were in Spain and Portugal, whether it be them too, or any other nation that participated in slavery, all the European nations around the globe. No matter who participated, he that stealeth a man and selleth him, he shall surely be put to death. It even mentions in the book of Revelation, he that leadeth into captivity will go into captivity. That's future prophecy. Deuteronomy 24:7 repeated that command. So the Hebrew phrase of stealing a man is universal. There's no ethic limitation in the text. And this is, again, like I said, whether they were doing it to themselves or whether they were doing it to other people, they were out of order or out of pocket, if I'm using modern vernacular. So the Atlantic slave trade began with violent capture, transplanting human beings, displacing them, removing them from mother and father, separating children from their parents, transport across borders, selling them in foreign markets. Every one of those steps matches the biblical definition of man stealing under God's law, which is punishable by death. So if the foundational act of a system is a capital crime, that system cannot be biblically authorized. Okay? And then lastly, chattel slavery began with man stealing, then it's unlawful by definition. Hebrew law, God's laws, evaluates legitimacy by origin. So, in other words, if the origin is unlawful, subsequent structure cannot sanctify it. Right? Make the tree good and its fruit will be good. If the tree is bad, the fruit will be bad. It's so simple. A is A. A cannot be A and non-A at the same time and in the same sense. So European American chattel slavery did not begin with voluntary contracts, debt servitude, judicial sentences. It began with forced capture and sale. And again, like I said, it's this type of stuff, like, I don't understand why people don't get it. It's a capital offense. So the system collapses at the foundation of this. There's no appeal to later regulations, because what you can do is you can essentially rewrite it in history books, which is what's happening now. You can retell it and say, oh, it was beneficial, or you can remove it from school systems altogether. All right. So let's move on, because I don't want this to be too long. All right. So rebuttal number 2. All right. I saw this Leviticus 25:44-46. Right. They're saying that allows slavery. So the claim is Israelites could own slaves from other nations. Right. And again, This argument isolates those those verses and reads it through post-Roman property law, because you have to eisegete, you have to input your ideas into the text in order to get out what they're getting out. The key issue is the Hebrew verb translated by. That verb does not inherently mean own as property. It can mean acquire through some other means, or obtain, or purchase services, or establish contractual relationship. So Genesis 4:1 uses that term to describe acquiring a child, right? Clearly not property. Then Leviticus 25, with that in mind, must be read within covenant, within covenant, or within a covenant lens, not imperial European American ownership categorization. So the passage does not introduce race-based hierarchy or um, biological a biological caste system, or something like unrestricted master authority, like this was Massa, right? It doesn't. That's not even there. It regulates labor within the Israelite jurisdiction. The absence of racial language in the statute is decisive. It's irrefutable. So again, the Atlantic system was explicitly racial. They were even like, oh, the Negroes, we need those types of slaves. They're the best workers. They're the hardest workers. They know the most. And, they did all the work in the colonies. As I mentioned before, I have plenty of textbooks that tell you of the ingenuity of our ancestors. Okay. So again, continuing on. So the context, right? Bond servitude under God's jurisdiction. So Leviticus 25 is part of a chapter that is centered on Jubilee. Jubilee established land restoration, debt release, economic reset. So the entire chapter limits accumulating, or the accumulation of permanent power, the accumulation of an imperial system, right? Where we're going to gain dominance over people in order to advance this country or the states. Verse 55 even clarifies the framework. It says, "For the children of Israel are servants unto me." Ultimate ownership belonged to God. But this is why, this godlike complex, with their mentality, they feel like they own everything. They feel like they own you, even still. Like I say, if you want to keep the Sabbath, no, sir, you can't keep the Sabbath. That's not what we do here. You can either stay working for us, or you can quit and find some other job. Okay. Only God, ultimate ownership belongs to God exclusively. Foreign laborers under God's law were subject to the Sabbath, as I mentioned earlier, Exodus 20:10. They were also subject to bodily protection, Exodus 21:26 and 27. They had judicial standards. The relationship operated under covenantal regulation, and American chattel slavery operated under a racial property code. Those are not parallel systems, okay? Or excuse me, I should say those are not perpendicular systems, but they are more so parallel in the sense that they never touch, okay? No permission for kidnapping. Okay, that's the third point. No permission for kidnapping, racial hierarchy, or abuse. Leviticus 25 does not override things like man stealing. That is mentioned in Exodus 21:16, or the fact that kidnapping was prohibited in Deuteronomy 24:7. So if someone was unlawfully captured, no later purchased legalized that act. Okay, so There's no mention of phenotype classification or generational womb. Like you had inheritance over a woman's womb, right? The legal denial of personhood. And again, that's happening in a different form here in the States. You just have to have discernment in order to see it. Now, uh, by contrast, the Virginia's 1662 law established hereditary slavery by maternal descent. And so that concept doesn't appear in Leviticus. Abuse is also restricted. As I mentioned, Exodus 21, 26, and 27 mandated emancipation for injury. That rule alone makes plantation violence incompatible with the laws of God. The last point on this slide, Deuteronomy 23, verse 15 and 16, addresses escaped servants and how they must not be returned. So the text says that thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped. He shall dwell with thee, thou shalt not oppress him. So again, this is not advisory language. Hey, like, let me advise you on this. It's a legal prohibition. Okay? It's a legal prohibition. Now compare that to things like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 or the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Because those laws required citizens to return escaped slaves. They were in direct violation of God's laws. They penalized those who gave shelter. If there was a European American that they were like, you know what? I'm starting to realize this slavery thing is not like these people are doing some terrible things to these people. And, they wanted to help them in some way. You were liable to be killed. So they were penalized if they gave us shelter, if they gave our ancestors shelter. Federalized slave capture. Okay? That's how deep those laws go. Okay? Deuteronomy 23, 15, and 16 forbids exactly that. And so if Leviticus 25 authorized permanent ownership, Deuteronomy 23 would contradict it. But instead, God sides with the escaped laborer. And again, like I said, that disqualifies American chattel slavery from its biblical legitimacy. All right. Now, let's continue. Here's another rebuttal. Okay, slavery was normal for the time. Okay, so they usually say something along the lines of everyone practiced slavery historically, right? That's going around like crazy nowadays. Oh, everyone practiced slavery. It's no big deal. Like, why is it all of a sudden it's like now everybody practiced slavery? It's kind of fishy, right? Like all of a sudden, because this argument shifts the standard from divine law to a cultural frequency, right? It suggests that if a practice was widespread in the ancient world, scripture must be accommodating it rather than judging it. As if God is, if you read the Old Testament, you would come to the conclusion that God was like, everything that the heathen is doing over there, you're going to do the exact opposite of it. Which is how you know for a fact that these people were operating under heathen laws and not the laws of God. And again, prevalence is not authorization. Okay, every nation had some form of slavery, but the prevalence of it is not an authorization of it. So they were still in error. The ancient, it's called the Near East nowadays. Okay, so I'm just going to go with the vernacular. The ancient Near East practice child sacrifice, ritual prostitution, absolute monarchy, debt enslavement without release. Okay, But guess where it's prohibited? The scriptures. It's prohibited in the scriptures. It's prohibited in the laws of God. God condemns it and even limits things, limits those practices. Okay. Historical normalcy. Okay. That's just I'm just saying, like, something that was normal historically. That's irrelevant if the covenant sets a different standard. Be ye therefore holy as I am holy. God had nothing to do with chattel slavery. And so the frequency does not equal righteousness, or does not imply that there should not be any restitution or judgment. The second point is the Torah is prescriptive, not descriptive. Okay. So the narrative presence in scripture does not equal moral endorsement all the time. Okay. Because obviously, there are situations where, there is a murder taking place, or idolatry taking place, or rebellion taking place. Yet those actions are not automatically authorized just because you read it there. Okay. So the Torah uses imperative legal language. Thou shalt not, or you shall. Leviticus 18:3 states that after the doings of the land of Egypt and after the doings of the land of Canaan, shall ye not do. I was just reading that to my children. I read the Bible to them every night, and we're going through the Old Testament. That's where we start. The law is our schoolmaster to lead us to Christ. So after the doings of the land of Egypt and after the doings of the land of Canaan, ye shall not do. So the Israelites, our people, are explicitly commanded to reject surrounding norms. Whatever's normal for them. Oh, they want to eat swine? Hey, go right ahead. You want to eat shellfish? Okay, go right ahead. You want to eat those things, that exotic foods? If that's what you want to do. But we're gonna keep the laws of God. So even if slavery were common, the question still remains: did God permit the specific structure of chattel slavery? The answer is no. Okay, so they commit a categorical fallacy when they say everyone practiced slavery historically. Right? You see how they usually they take the categorical fallacy of the term slavery and put every subgroup in that group. Okay. The next point, Israel commanded to be different. That's Exodus chapter 22, verse 21. That very verse says that thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We cried out to God. Our ancestors cried out to God. And guess what? God heard them and he says, you know what? This is how I want you to return the favor. When you're in the land and you're ruling, don't do this. This command grounds ethics in the Israelites' historical memory of oppression. It's a covenant reminder from generation to generation. Here is what you should not do. And like I said, demonstrating that these people were not operating under the Hebrew laws. They weren't reading the scriptures. It's impossible that they were reading the scriptures. It's absolutely impossible. Okay. Egypt practiced forced labor. Israel experienced it. So the Torah uses that experience as a moral warning. Oppression is not normalized. It is remembered as injustice. But why is there so much effort in our time now to suppress anyone who has a problem with authority? As if the one who has a problem with authority is always wrong. That's how it's painted. So a system that reproduces Egypt's structure contradicts the very memory of the Torah and the things that God commanded the Israelites to remember. Normal practice is not logically equivalent to moral justification. So if majority behavior established morality, then say for example, then Baal worship would be justified in the land of Canaan. Roman crucifixion would be morally neutral. And the things like a pagan temple or the economics surrounding that would be acceptable. Prostitution in the temple, all those sorts of things that went on in the first century in Rome. So the Torah does not evaluate righteousness by statistical prevalence. It evaluates it by covenant conformity, conforming to the laws of God. Be ye therefore separate, says the Lord, and do not touch that which is unclean. So conformity to the laws of God is all throughout the Bible. It's all throughout God's laws. Even if every surrounding nation practiced slavery without limits, the Israelites were not permitted to mirror them. That's okay. Those people are wicked. Those European Americans, they're practicing chattel slavery. They're wicked. But somehow we've said, oh, they've brought Christianity to the world, and I'm going to get to that. I'm jumping ahead, but moral law is not determined by anthropology. Human beings don't get to determine moral law. The Europeans don't get to determine what is morally acceptable for everybody. It's determined by the commandments and the laws of God. Okay, let's move on. Now, the fourth rebuttal I hear is some masters treated slaves well. Okay, so they'll say things like slavery was not always brutal, right? And again, this claim shifts attention from the structure of the system to like an isolated anecdote. It's usually echoed in Southern revisionist narratives that are rooted in like a lost cause tradition. I've heard, and I mentioned this before. I saw a pastor on TikTok, several pastors on TikTok, thinking, "Oh, the blacks, they repented and they accepted Christ." It's all lies. Writers like Robert Louis Dabney, he was a 19th century Presbyterian theologian. He defended Confederate slavery as like benevolent or as good and as patriarchal. You know what I mean? And so modern commentators even argue that plantation slavery was complex and sometimes humane. That's what you hear nowadays. You know, it was complex. And so when they speak in those ambiguous terms, what are they really saying? They're not really saying anything. It's an illusion or an attempt to deceive and to kind of leave you on a cliff up to an interpretation rather than to take full accountability for for the deeds that took place in the past. So Dabney, for example, he argued that slavery was a civilizing institution. I mean, you hear white nationalists say that today. I saw a white nationalist on X say something along the lines of slavery is Black History Month. As if he was basically saying this, that that slavery was a civilizing institution. And morally defensible within Christian society. That's what Dabney says. That's what Robert Dabney said, a 19th century Presbyterian theologian. And so, ironically, a lot of his writings influenced post-Civil War Southern theology and shaped generations of pro-Confederate Christian thought. I remember reading about them when I was attending seminary. And I did, you know, I mean, I'm not going to, pivot from any type of writing. I want all of the smoke. I want to know everything that they thought, because you have to know the opposition. Now, the argument that he was purporting depends on selective storytelling. So if some masters were kind, the system was not inherently immoral. So what? The Torah does not judge morality by anecdotes. It doesn't matter what you say. You guys are still out of line. Biblical law, and this is the next point, biblical law judges systems, not exceptions. So God's law evaluated what a system legally permits or prohibits, whether explicitly or implicitly. So now what it doesn't address is how kindly someone behaves within it. Oh, you got that one black friend, or you have that one guy who, he treated slaves well. Like, it's so crazy. Deuteronomy 16:20, right, says that justice shalt thou pursue. So if justice thou shalt pursue, where was the justice here in America? I mean, they say they were Christians. They brought Christianity here. Where was it? Justice is structural. So if a legal system permits the sell, or it's permissible to sell children, to force labor without wages, to have corporal punishment, and deny legal testimony or legal representation, that system is unjust, regardless of kindness. The 11th commandment, I remember the late Vodi Bakum said something about the 11th commandment being thou shalt be kind. And that's European American Christianity. So kindness does not override unlawful authority. It does not even exempt what your ancestors did. In the Hebrew law, legal framework is the primary focus. Moreover, Exodus 21, 26, and 27, I keep emphasizing these same verses because injury results in freedom. Okay? We best learn through repetition all throughout the Old Testament. You're like, why does God keep re-emphasizing those same laws? Because as an educator for a decade now, that's how we learn. We learn through repetition. You keep reminding yourself over and over the same thing. That's how you learn. So the text states that if a man smite the eye of his servant, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. Now, this is just one piece of that man's member, his eye. And we have evidence of fingers, genitalia, other limbs. This establishes a clear principle that permanent bodily injury triggered emancipation. So now compare that with documented slave codes in colonial America. Things like the Virginia Slave Code of 1705. Masters were legally permitted to whip enslaved persons. Killing a slave during punishment was not automatically treated as murder under the Virginia Slave Code. You can look it up. And moreover, here in my state, and I didn't read about this until I got to the university, the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740 explicitly authorized corporal punishment, restricted legal recourse for enslaved persons. Absolutely crazy. Chattel slavery institutionalized violence. Violence was not incidental, it was structural. The plantation discipline required whippings as labor enforcement. You were like a horse. I mean, I'm talking about violence. That's how like, it just unthinkable, unthinkable branding, mutilation in early colonial periods, legal prohibition of literacy to suppress resistance. And when I say literacy, I mean like learning their language. Not that we didn't have language or have culture before, because we did, but what I mean is learning their language, learning their books, and things of that nature. So the system depended on coercion to function, as it still is today. That's why so many people are moaning. When the righteous are in rulership, the people rejoice. When the wicked bear rule, the people mourn. That's why people are in absolutely disarray here in America today. It's not ice in Minnesota. It's deeper than that. So the Torah law, by contrast, restricted power and imposed liability on the stronger party. A system that required violence to sustain labor is not neutral. It's unlawful according to the laws of God. Right? The next claim, this is the rebuttal. So Christians use the Bible to justify slavery. Right? So the claim is God-fearing Christians own slaves. This claim argues that because someone professed to be a Christian and they participated in slavery, the system must have been compatible with biblical faith. That's how they got you. That's how they got people. Because if you can make the claim that professing Christians practice this, then the legal justification for it becomes apparent in your mind that, okay, God approves of this. And so you don't even go to the scriptures to test out whether or not it's true. Historically, major pro slavery Christians defended this. People like James Thornwell, back in the early 1800s. I think he was born in 1812, died in 1862, something like that. Mid 1800s, something like that. He was a Presbyterian theologian here in South Carolina, and he argued that slavery was not a sin and was divinely permitted. We're talking about the Bible Belt, people. We're talking about the place where you would think that, oh, they're getting the scriptures. They're, teaching the scriptures as they should. Richard Furman, a Baptist minister who wrote defenses of slaveholding as biblical legitimate. Okay, because they needed the priests, the ministers, to give this out to the community, to keep the people in line for the economy. I'm telling you, man, this study has really, like, it's just opened up my eyes to like what was really going on back in those times, man. These people were not operating under the laws of God. A Confederate, by the name of Robert Dabney, who I mentioned, he was a Confederate chaplain in the military, and he was also a theologian. And he described it as benevolent, that the institution was benevolent, good, and oppressed racial equality, that they had a right to rule over the people who they colonized. There's nothing new under the sun, right? Because you can still see that today. And so those men were not fringe voices. They were not on the edge of garments. They influenced Southern Protestant Christianity for generations, people. However, participation by clergy does not equal conformity to the Torah. Just because you participated with those men, you agree with those men, right? Church fathers, right? These guys are obviously not church fathers, but When you walk hand in hand with those traditions, you assume that you're walking in hand with the godly. But the scriptures repeatedly records religious leaders acting contrary to covenant law within the Israelite community. Jeremiah 5:31, the prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests bear rule by their means. You can take that and ascribe it to non-Israelites as well, which I'm ascribing it in this context to European Americans who are non-Israelites. Religious identity does not guarantee biblical fidelity. I saw today someone was saying, someone like their identity, they were like, I'm a Christian, and this was like their ethnicity, right? Your religious identity does not guarantee biblical fidelity. Just because you're a Christian, you say you're a Christian, doesn't mean you're faithful to the scriptures. Doesn't mean you adhere to the laws of God, right? So, so in the next point, right? Reality, okay? So the Slave Bible removed liberation texts, as I mentioned in the first compilation. Between 1807 and 1834, the Society of the Conversion of Negro Slaves produced what is now known as the Slave Bible for the usage in the British Caribbean. All right. And obviously these are documented facts. Large portions of the Old Testament were removed. Major prophetic texts condemning oppression were excluded. Only carefully selected New Testament passages emphasized obedience were retained in those were retained in the Bible. And this is why some of our people will say, oh, well, I don't believe anything that they gave us. You got to go deeper. Our people are Hebrews. We had Hebraic customs long before. God said that he was going to scatter us into all nations. And in those nations that we were scattered, we were going to become like the people that we were scattered to, worshiping idols. Okay, so this is that what they did was not accidental editing. It was intentional. Like I said, that wasn't a missionary letter or a missionary thing. Oh, let's, we're doing a good thing. We're going to, revolutionize the world and get these people saved. Okay. Exodus, Jubilee, and freedom laws were deleted. And as I mentioned earlier, Exodus 21:16, man stealing. Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, asylum for escaped servants. And Jeremiah 22:13 condemned the condemnation of unpaid labor. All of those things were absent. Okay. In addition to that, I'm just going to skip to the last point. So censorship, that's going on a lot in our time today, right? The censorship reveals tension because you don't have to censor someone if they're not speaking the truth. Right? I mean, to me that makes sense because if they're in alignment with what you're saying, there's no need to censor them. Now you can censor someone who is spreading false information, but then who determines what is false? Is it logic? Is it the laws of God? Because if slavery aligned seamlessly with scripture, literacy would not have been criminalized. Liberation narratives would not have been suppressed. Biblical access would not have been restricted. But instead, slaveholding societies enacted laws like the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740, which prohibited literacy education for enslaved Hebrews. The truth was treated as destabilizing. And the Torah prohibits that. Okay. Moreover, so Paul told slaves to obey masters. The New Testament endorsed slavery. That's their claim. So the argument is usually commonly grounded in passages like Ephesians 6:5, Colossians 3:22, and 1 Peter 2:18. But these verses are usually heavily cited in American pro-slavery sermons throughout the 18th and 19th century. You just go back. I have an app. It's called Sermon Audio or Sermon Index. You go back and listen to some of those sermons. I can guarantee you those verses, Ephesians 6:5, Colossians 3:22, and then 1 Peter 2:18 are going to be cited as justification, because figures like people like James Thornwell and Charles Jones, both were Presbyterian ministers. They were known as the apostles to the slaves. Cultural appropriation. So they relied on those passages to argue that the New Testament affirmed slaveholding as compatible with Christianity. I'm telling you, these people are dangerous, man, because you have to be absolutely dangerous to manipulate the text to get it to say what you want it to say for political power. I mean, have y'all seen the movie, what's that movie called? Enoch? They were using the Bible to push a political agenda. It means nothing to them. And again, I'm not saying, you know, that there aren't some people who genuinely read the scriptures today and, love God and things like that. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that by and large, the reasoning was, if Paul instructs slaves to obey, then slavery itself must be legitimate. But instruction within a condition is not the same as morally endorsement of that condition. Okay. So in addition to that, Paul addressed existing conditions. Like I said in the previous lecture, they were colonized by the Greeks, and then they turned around and was colonized by the Romans. Paul is writing within the Roman Empire. Roman slavery. The Israelites were in perpetual slavery. Remember, God says he was going to scatter them. So they were going to go as slaves. It wasn't exile. It wasn't like, hey, let's get them out of the land. Because if you listen to the Jewish man today, or the Jewish people, they'll tell you, oh, they were exiled. No. God says that he was going to scatter the Israelites into slavery. They were going to be colonized, conquered. Okay, so Paul is writing within a Roman Empire, Roman context. Roman slavery differed significantly from American chattel slavery, if you can believe that. Because, again, like I said, it was not race-based. Enslaved persons could earn or purchase their freedom. Heck, you can even buy Roman citizenship. Yeah, do some research on that. Legal status was not permanently tied to skin color. So just because they were Romans doesn't mean that you didn't have like black Romans. And again, but when you listen to, revisionists, they'll tell you that, oh, Romans, oh, of course they were white. But Paul's letters are pastoral correspondences to Israelites navigating and in a wicked empire that they were in as slaves, as pilgrims, as scattered. Nowhere does Paul establish a legal code for slaveholding or define humans as property. So you can't create a theological defense of race-based bondage by using Paul's letters. In fact, in Philemon, Paul urges the reception of Onesimus. He says, not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother, beloved. Philemon, that's Philemon 1:16. So the language undermines permanent hierarchy, ownership. Pastoral instruction under occupation is not civil legislation. Okay. So again, he never authorized kidnapping or race-based slavery. Paul is using the Old Testament. Even in 1 Timothy 1:10, it explicitly lists man stealers. So the Greek term refers to slave traders, those who traffic human beings. It's listed among sins that are contrary to sound doctrine. And so that directly contradicts the foundation of the Atlantic slave trade or the sub-Saharan slave trade, where North Africans were pushed out of, or excuse me, I would say, I'm going to say North Africans because they were in the African continent, but people who resided in the northern part of Africa were pushed down into central and to west and even into lower regions of sub-Sahara. So those things directly contradict the foundation of the Atlantic slave trade. Paul condemned the trade itself. He would have. He never authorizes racial hierarchy. Okay. And then the last point, Torah law remains the ethical foundation. Paul explicitly affirms continuity with the law. Romans 3:31. He says, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. No, we establish the law. So the New Testament does not repel, meaning that it keeps a hold of the Old Testament. We did not have the New Testament yet. What they were using was the Old Testament. This was before the New Testament was compiled. So Exodus 21:16, where is Paul getting that? He's getting that from the law. Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, asylum for the oppressed. Leviticus 25, limitations on servanthood. Jubilee. So if the Torah defined kidnapping as a capital crime, then no epistle would nullify that. Okay. Europeans abolished slavery. We've heard it before. And this argument is often embedded in Western civic memory, right? It's like, hey, we abolished slavery, right? And so they'll usually reference people like William Wilberforce, who was a British abolitionist. Or they'll mention Abraham Lincoln, who died in 1865 because he wasn't going to live after this. The U.S. president during emancipation. But the narrative typically frames abolitionists as evidence of Christian moral triumph, right? But the historical consequences matter because European powers initiated the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century. They expanded it for over 300 years. They built massive economic systems on unpaid labor. And those insurance companies still have that labor today. And so if you build massive economic systems on unpaid labor, isn't that unjust? How do you defend it theologically and legally? Because obviously they do. And they have. Abolition came after. But abolition came after slave revolts. Haiti's Revolution, 1791. Our people weren't playing. You didn't just, these people were so docile and we just conquered them. Hell no. There was revolts all the time. And so, again, they don't teach you that in school. There were economic industrial shifts, sustained resistance, international instability. I keep referencing the book behind me. It's well documented that the population, it's almost like, it's so funny because even in the Hebrew text, it says the population, the Egyptians were like, these Hebrews are growing and growing. They're eventually going to outnumber us and overtake us. Ironically, the Europeans said the same thing about us here. But ending in injustice centuries after creating it does not retroactively justify the creation. So this moral righteousness being measured by obedience to law, like these guys were breaking God's laws, okay? So you cannot create injustice and claim credit for ending it. The Hebrew law does not reward cessation of wrongdoing as though it were virtuous. So if a person steals property for years, profits from it, and then like all of a sudden stops, the stopping is required, right? You should stop, bro. Like you got enough land, but not praiseworthy, right? So the the prior harm still remains. It's still here. Trauma follows. So under the Torah, wrongdoing created an obligation, a restitution, because it's justice. So the fact that Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and then eventually slavery in 1833 does not erase what happened. It does not erase centuries of human trafficking by them or generational labor extraction or even the accumulated wealth that was built on coercive work. So ending a violation does not convert the violation into righteousness. So saying Europeans abolished slavery is so ambiguous. But this is why you have to live on those anecdotes. You have to be careful with them because when you hear them, it's like, oh yeah, let me cite Abraham Lincoln, but then forget about all the things that I just mentioned. And so Jeremiah 22:13, all you need is the scriptures. Unpaid labor is wickedness. It says, woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that uses his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. So notice the structure. The structure is building wealth through unpaid labor, and is condemned as wickedness. Okay? So there is going to be a restitution eventually. Now, this verse does not include a clause that says, unless you later free them. The moral charge attaches to the building itself. So European colonial economies, such as plantation agriculture, shipping, exporting, importing, banking, insurance, were constructed through unpaid labor. And it was very systematic. So the prophetic standard that God gave remains unchanged. Biblical justice requires restitution. Exodus 22 established restitution for theft. Leviticus 6 required repayment plus added compensation. Numbers 5 mandated restoring what was wrongfully taken. So justice according to God's laws, the Hebrew laws, non-European American laws, was acknowledgement and was repayment and was restitution. All those things happened. So abolition removed legal bondage, but it did not provide things like land restoration or wage repayment or generational compensation. In fact, after emancipation in the United States, systems like the black codes, convict leasing, sharecropping. My grandmother was, God rest her soul, was a sharecropper. And man, I'm talking about work. Oh my God. But those things functioned as economic continuations of coercive labor. Right? You know, they try to say, well, if you don't work, you don't eat. Abusing the text, man. Under God's laws, ending wrongdoing without restitution leaves the account unsettled. So you can't stop oppression, or I should say stopping oppression is necessary. But reframing the harm is not justice. Repairing the harm is justice. Okay? Let's continue. Another rebuttal that's very common is Africans sold to Africans. I saw someone say this like a long time ago, so I just thought, obviously, I'd include it in this. So the claim Africans participated in the trade, right? Now, this argument asserts that because some African rulers and merchants participated in selling captives, Hebrew captives, to European traders, European powers cannot bear primary moral responsibility. So it's often framed in discourse like, if Africans sold them, Europeans are not uniquely guilty, right? So historically, certain like West African uh, West African groups such as Dahomey and Ashanti, they did engage in capturing and selling war captives, Hebrew captives. But that fact is not disputed. We know that. But you see how it's very specific because I want to say like participation in a trade does not define the structure or the scale of the trade. It's just like let's just say you got one group that participated in the slave trade. You say, well, look, they did this. I don't know how many times when I was teaching middle school math, I heard that. Look, he did this. It would be the lawbreaker. He'd be like, well, what about this guy over here? And so that's what's happening. It's like this childish way of dealing with a very gross reality. The transatlantic slave trade was financed by European capital. They supplied the ships, transported on European ships, insured by their firms, codified by their laws, and then racialized within their European colonies. So that codification originated in Europe. So without sustained external demand and maritime capability, the system would have never industrialized and went as far as it did. And again, the Torah condemned buyers and sellers equally. Exodus 21:16. He that stealeth a man and sells him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So the text condemns three parties: the person who kidnapped, the seller, and the possessor. God ain't playing. Every hand. Have you read Psalms 83? If you haven't, you should probably go take a look. So the Torah does not create moral hierarchy between supply and demand. All participants in man stealing are going to bear their guilt. Therefore, if African rulers captured and sold unlawfully, they also violated the Torah. If European traders purchased and transported unlawfully, they also violated. So shared guilt does not erase individual responsibility. But again, when you listen to these people who say Africans sold Africans, I'm telling you, it's all deception. We live in an age of deception. Okay? Participation does not legitimize the system. The existence of multiple actors does not convert wrongdoing into righteousness. So if multiple parties engaged in theft, it's still theft, right? It's still stealing. So in legal reasoning, it's still stealing. Widespread participation increases culpability. It does not decrease it. Because if a crime is committed, they're like, okay, well, he was the shooter. He was the driver. He was the instigator. This guy funded everything. They're going to get all of them. So if it operates like that in human courts, what makes you think it's not going to operate like that in the divine court? Okay. So moreover, pre-Atlantic Hebrew servitude systems differed very structurally. I can't think of the book right now. It might be Hebrew Customs of West Africans, and I want to be careful about mentioning various books because some of these books have increased in cost, and they share some jewels that are absolutely hidden from European American thought. Okay, but pre-Atlantic Hebrew servitude systems differed structurally. They were not race based. They were not permanently inheritable through maternal descent, and they often allowed assimilation or even release. And European colonial law transformed human trafficking into lifelong chattel systems. You were a slave forever. Okay. And this last fallacy. Okay. So this argument is a classic logical error. As I mentioned with the kids in middle school, it's the others did it too fallacy. Therefore, our wrongdoing is mitigated. It's like, hey, look, he was talking while you were teaching. So, in the laws of God, guilt is not necessarily comparable or comparative. If you're guilty, you're just guilty. And that sounds like circular reasoning, but I could have probably articulated that a little bit better, but you understand what I mean. Because each party stands accountable for its own violation of the law. Not to say that there isn't corporate punishment, because obviously we see that in the Hebrew scriptures as well. Deuteronomy 24:16 established individual responsibility. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. Meaning that obviously you could be, your own sins condemned you. And then obviously we've seen that if the leaders of Israel were committing sin, the entire nation went into captivity. So we can see there was a mutual judgment that has happened in the laws of God. Okay. Rebuttal number 9: slavery was economic, not racial. So they'll usually say something like race was not central. Okay. So that argument frames chattel slavery as primarily labor driven, right? Suggesting that economic demand, not racial ideology, structured the system. But if race determined legal systems, then race is central by definition, right? Economic exploitation alone does not require biological inheritance, but racial law does. So the issue is not motive, it's codification. It's how the laws were codified. European slavery tied status to our appearance. If you were ruddy colored or black is what we would call, or Negro, or Niger, Niger, which is also in the New Testament in Acts 13 as being descriptive of the Israelites, or swarthy, right? It was tied to our skin complexion. Concrete statutory evidence demonstrates this. The Virginia law of 1662, that statute declared that the status of a child followed the condition of the mother. It's still around today. It lets you go and sleep with a woman without marrying her. That law right there is going to find you. And of course, it's a Virginia law, but it's a different type of law that's written in what is called child support. Okay. The legal status goes to the mother immediately. That dad has no rights. She don't even have to put you on the birth certificate in the hospital. Okay. Because again, Hebrew women were classified as enslaved. You are owned by the state. Okay. You are owned by the state still to this day. Because African women were classified as enslaved, their children inherited that status automatically. And so this created perpetual hereditary slavery. All right. Let's see. I'm just going to go to the next one. Hereditary bondage enforced by phenotype, right? So over time, colonial courts increasingly relied on visible physical traits to determine someone's status. Okay, so by the 18th century, there were like classifications in the colonies, and so they were structured around. And I could be wrong. There could be more than this, but if I'm not mistaken, Niger it's just Latin for Negro, mulatto, white. So, and again, this is where the classification of being white came from, because So I'm not going to get into all of that, but those were not cultural categories. They were legal categories. Okay. So being called white is a legal category, or was a legal category specifically. It became a legal category specifically. The U.S. Supreme Court affirmed racial exclusion explicitly in the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that persons of Hebrew African descent had no rights that white citizens were bound to respect. So that ruling tied legal personhood directly to race, or what was later classified as race, according to them, is not a biblical ethnicity. And so that was not incidental prejudice, it was constitutional law. No such hierarchy exists in the laws of God. So again, what I'm saying, where did these people getting this stuff from? Where did they get these laws from? Who gave them these types of laws? What type of laws are we operating under? I'm telling you. So there's no law that states that skin color determines servitude, or that children inherit permanent bondage based because they come from their mother and their mother's in bondage. So that covenantal status, or covenantal status is that covenantal status is biologically fixed. There's no law that states that. Deuteronomy 24:16 prohibited inherited punishment. And then, as I mentioned in the last one, Job 31:15 affirmed shared divine creation. And it says, did not he that made me in the womb make him? So biblical hierarchy, again, is covenantal. It's not necessarily biological in the way in which they are using it. God created ethnicities. That is 100% true. But racial caste law, according to European Americans, is absolutely disjointed from the Hebrew Israelite customs and the laws that God gave our forefathers. Rebuttal number 10. God used slavery for a greater good. Okay, so the claim is slavery spread Christianity. Okay, this argument asserts that although slavery was harsh, it resulted in things like Christian conversion. It resulted in the spread of the gospel in the Americas, right? The Great Commission. I mean, how often is that taught in seminaries and churches around America? Go into the world, make disciples. I'm telling you, like, they've created a system outside of the system that God gave our forefathers. They made their own system outside of it. It's like it's sort of like where God is in the real, like that's wherever God is, that's the real. And then like outside of God, that's the unreal. That's what it is. It's like here the custom is in the laws of God, and then here is where the European system, the European laws that they have instituted are absolutely disjoint from the laws of God and the system that God gave our forefathers. So they also cite things like, oh, well, the black church wouldn't be in existence if it wasn't for us. And it appears in older missionary writings, right? And in certain like providential interpretations of history that suggest like divine sovereignty transforms moral evil into salvific or salvation outcomes, right? They're like, we need to send missionaries to Africa. There's places that need us. And don't get me wrong, there are, countries, Muslim countries, so to speak, where you have a small minority of people who are like extremists and want to overthrow and things like that. You got extremists in every community. I mean, the KKK, they were Christians. You have, you know, obviously Zionists who are, uh, making up things about the laws of God and saying that they have a right to that land, but they're, annihilating people as a consequence of it. So this this idea that God is authorizing this, whether it be European Jewish people with the new creation of the state of Israel, or whether it be manifest destiny, right? The outcome, guys, this is God. This is a God thing. I'm telling you, God is in neither place. So the claim shifts the focus from moral legality to perceived spiritual results. The question under Hebrew law is not what came out of it, like, right? Like, what came out of it? Like, if we do this, look at the good that could come out of this. It wasn't that. The question is, was it authorized? Did God authorize it? God does not require evil to accomplish good. I've heard that. I mean, I remember when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, people were like, "Oh, trying to look." And there's nothing wrong with trying to look for the good out of a bad situation, but you can't say that God does not require evil, or that God requires evil to accomplish good. You can't say that, because the scriptures distinguishes between God redeeming evil and God commanding evil. Genesis 50:20 says, "Yea, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good." That's what Joseph told his brothers. So the text affirms that divine sovereignty, or God has divine sovereignty over all events, not divine approval of the evil act itself. Okay? So, and again, if you look in hindsight, God allowed the Israelites to always go into captivity among heathen nations and to worship those heathen gods that those nations, to whom they were scattered to, were participating in. So it's to discipline them. So kidnapping was prohibited, oppression is prohibited, unpaid labor prohibited. So if an act is explicitly prohibited, it cannot become righteous by producing later benefit. God may bring good from sin, but he does not command sin to produce good. That doesn't make any sense. So this logic essentially can justify any atrocity that they come up with. They can always justify it, which is what we see. If good outcomes validate immoral benefit, or excuse me, if good outcomes invalidate moral methods, then forced conversions could be defended. Colonial conquest could be sanctified. Cultural destruction could be excused, which is what we see. I'm telling you, I'm laughing, but it's really not funny. Consequential reasoning dissolves moral boundaries. So once outcome replaces command, law loses its authority. And that logic historically, like, I mean, for example, you got the Crusade era, right? You got colonial missionary expansion. Read about some of those missionary expansions, man. Those things were not all, let's go over here and give them Christmas trees. That manifest destiny theology, I'm telling you, it was absolutely wicked. So when the ends justify the means, atrocity becomes adaptable and an adjustment. Hebrew law, and the last one, right? So with respect to the Hebrew law, again, I keep going back to the law because, again, this is what the New Testament writers were using. Deuteronomy 12:32. What thing soever I command you, observe to do it. Whatever I command you to do it. Observe it. Observe to do it. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it. So imagine you're going on a straight road and you veer off to the left or to the right. You're deviating from the standard. And God says, never deviate from the standard. Not by adapting to the culture of your error. If kidnapping is forbidden, then it is still forbidden in later generations, right? So if later generations built churches and banks and things of that nature off of those things, those people were violating the laws of God. If oppression is condemned, it remains condemned even if faith communities emerge afterward. Hebrew law does not evaluate righteousness by historical utility, right? By the fact that you could, hey, we got a church out of this. Brother, look what you built it on. You built it on blood. You built it on wickedness. So it evaluates, or it is evaluated based on covenant fidelity. So therefore, like claiming that slavery produced Christian faith does not convert slavery into obedience. That's why it hasn't worked. It's not productive because you're told to not keep the laws of God. This is why they shy away from it too, because if they did, they would be absolutely convicted. And keep in mind, Jesus kept the laws of God. So are you following in the footsteps of Jesus by not keeping the laws of God? You got to think about that. Rebuttal number 11, slaves should just move on, right? And I wanted to save this for literally towards the end because I've heard this so often, right? And I'm coming to a close eventually. So the claim is slavery ended, so the issue is resolved. And that argument treats abolition as closure, like it's over and done with, guys, get over it. The reasoning suggests that because legal bondage formally ended in 1865 in the U.S., that moral discussion should also end, that we should just stop talking about it. It makes absolutely no sense. Because if that's the case, we should get rid of the Bible too. And they should never use, or excuse me, they should get rid of the Bible and should never use it. And should stop talking about it because the events in it is over and done with. But, and I hope you see how that doesn't make any sense, because Hebrew law does not equate cessation with resolution. In other words, ending an unlawful act stops further violation. Ending an unlawful act stops further violation, but it does not automatically repair the accumulated harm. You can't just write a law, 1964 Civil Rights Act. You can't just write a law and think all is well. Let's just write a law. That's not restitution. Because under the laws of God, resolution required restoration. It required the people to be restored back to their dignity. And again, the scriptures are very adamant about how that restoration is going to take place for our people, the Hebrews, the Israelites. Okay. In addition, so we have the Torah. The Torah forbids oppressing the formerly enslaved. Exodus 22:21, right? It still applies. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that command does not expire after liberation, right? The Torah does not distinguish between an enslaved person or enslaving a person and then economically exporting a person after they are released, because both of those things violate covenant ethics. So you can't do things like, for example, post-slavery systems continued after oppression. So you can't do things like black codes. All right, we're going to release them, but guess what? We're going to slap some black codes on them, restricting their mobility and labor options. And then we're going to do something like convict leasing, where we criminalize minor infractions and reintroduce forced labor. Like, You can't do that. Or sharecropping systems that locked freedmen into debt dependency. Segregation laws enforced economic and political exclusion. So those were not identical to plantation slavery, but they were like perpetually coercive structures. They were psyops. They were like, we're gonna give you the illusion that you're gonna get what we that we you're excuse me, they're we're gonna give you the illusion that you're going to obtain what we have. I hope you're getting this, okay? I spent a lot of time on this, so I just when it comes to, like let's just say ending legal bondage, right, did not eliminate how we were exploited after, how our ancestors were exploited after. The system adapted, the paperwork changed. And so under if you evaluate it under Hebraic analysis, continued oppression remains unlawful even if the labels change, right? Because you can't hide from God. You cannot hide from God and in God's laws. God's laws are settled in heaven and on earth as well. So Exodus 22:21, of course, like I said, still applies. So that memory of what happened in Egypt is meant to prevent repetition. If a society frees the enslaved, then imposes legal systems that maintain economic subjugation, then it has not fulfilled the spirit of liberation. It's not operating under the laws of God. All right, and I believe this is the last one. So uh, if you've watched this whole thing, I really appreciate it. I don't know what the algorithm does with the content, but I hope this reaches a good bit of people. But this is the last rebuttal. So, and I'm sure there's other rebuttals like this. Took me a while to create. So I don't. If you could think of a rebuttal, I would love to hear it. Definitely let me know what you think in the comment section wherever I post this. Okay. So usually they'll say something like that. This is revisionist history, right? When I say something about it, right? So they're like, this is a reinterpretation of the past. And that argument suggests that critics of European American chattel slavery are modern distortions imposed onto historical actors. So the argument suggests that critics of European American chattel slavery are modern distorters and are imposed to those historical actors. So again, they would call me a revisionist. They're like, "Oh, you're revising history," because I don't agree with them. So they'll often phrase it as, "You're reading today's values into the past," or "People back then thought differently," or "You're reinterpreting scripture through modern ideology." However, reinterpretation is not inherently distortion, okay? And it's not even reinterpretation. It's really just reading the scriptures as God has said it. So the real question is, who altered the original framework? Who told them that this is what that meant? Because obviously, like just reading it verbatim, like there's no way you can get what they did out of it. No way. The revision occurred during slavery. So historical documentation shows that theological revision did not begin with modern critique. So that's going to be, they're going to run from that. They're going to say it occurred during the height of slaveholding societies. It happened long before us. So pro-slavery sermons in the 18th 18th and 19th centuries reframed biblical servitude as racial hierarchy, or Southern theologians such as James Thornwell argued that Scripture established a permanent slave class, a claim not found in the Torah. Legal codes were harmonized with selective biblical interpretation. So the interpretive shift happened when biblical categories were merged with Roman property law and racial pseudoscience. That is where the revision took place. They are responsible. Edited Bibles, the slave Bible, Exodus narratives, Jubilee laws, prophetic prophetic condemnation of the oppressed. It's coming. So additionally, those laws I mentioned, like the South Carolina Negro Act, prohibited teaching people how to read. You couldn't teach them how to read. They would probably kill someone for teaching a Negro how to read or a Niger how to read. Literacy was treated as a threat to the stability of the structure of the slave system. Access to the full scriptures was restricted. We cannot let them get a hold of these parts. So censorship is about control. If the Bible naturally supported chattel slavery, there would have been no need to restrict access to its full text. I mean, right? So returning to the Torah context restores the truth. Returning to the laws of God restores the truth. And this is why we're teaching the Gentiles now. Because the ignorance is pervasive. Re-centering interpretation on the laws of God does not revise history. It restores legal context. It restores the dignity of humanity, all ethnicities, and removes the ambiguity that came with their reign. And again, I might be, oh, you hate European Americans. No, I don't. I don't hate anybody. I have no hatred in my heart towards anyone. But I do believe in speaking the truth, and I think all of us should, regardless of the outcome. So the interpretive question becomes, does race-based hereditary bondage appear in the Torah? Does perpetual property status appear in the Torah? Does biological caste appear in the Torah? The answer is no. The original framework is that God owns people. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and they that dwell therein. He's talking about the objects within this universe, all of it. The stars, the sun, the moon, the people, the animals, the food, all of it. Okay, so kidnapping is a capital crime. Oppression is condemned. Restitution is required. And that's how you remain faithful to the text. Okay. So my final conclusion is that every major justification that I hear, it collapses when you read the Bible, precept upon precept. So when you test those things against kidnapping, how it's punishable by capital crime, how oppression of the vulnerable is forbidden, how injury triggers an emancipation, and that, even if you had a so-called runaway slave, that person could seek asylum. It's so funny because I was just reading about that in Moses, when Moses was talking to the Israelites. It said if somebody accidentally killed a man, he could flee. That's a different scenario. So that was, disregard that. But it just made me think about that. And in addition to that, so you could seek asylum, obviously, if you escaped because you were being mistreated. And then you have restitution, or restitution is essentially mandatory for theft. None of the common defenses in my time here in 2026, such as, linguistic, historical, providential, even comparing, tit for tat, survive under covenant scrutiny. None of it survives the scriptures. So if a defense contradicts explicit commands, it collapses. It goes against the Bible. So the Bible does not condone it. Chattel slavery violates God's laws. It violates God's logic, and it violates God's justice. Structurally, chattel slavery was man stealing. You could own babies, separate babies, sell them to the highest bidder, codify racial hierarchy into civil law, authorize violence or labor control. You could beat them. You could hurt them really bad and force them into subjection. So in other words, you denied their personhood under a statute. Absolute wickedness. So a system that requires violating those multiple statutes cannot be harmonized with God's laws. It's impossible. Biblical defense requires distortion and omission. Historically, defense of chattel slavery requires people to misrepresent Paul, which Peter said is going to happen. Required removal of liberation passages because, God forbid they read those. Suppression of literacy. We got to keep them from reading, guys, so that we can, they're not gonna be able to speak our language, so they're not gonna know what we're saying. So we're gonna be able to manipulate them. And merging Hebrew categories. Let's merge the Bible, right? Because we got to get our own people to believe it and be okay with it. Let's merge the scriptures with the Bible. Or excuse me. Let's merge the scriptures with the Bible. Let's merge Roman property law with the Bible to justify it through reframing the language of the scriptures and make it about making the term slave mean like permanent chattel, permanent human property. So you got to edit the scriptures in order to survive because the scripture stands against that. It's in direct opposition to it. So the conclusion is simple. Therefore, it was never biblical. Not by structure, not by legality, not by its covenant. European chattel slavery was not an imperfect application of biblical law. It was a violation of it. It wasn't, oh man, we it was just an imperfect application. We didn't understand the law. No, you guys were violating it. Just period. And so I don't know how long this has been, but I definitely want to say shalom and thank you for watching. But the question was never whether people used the Bible. The question was whether they obeyed it. Because God defines justice. And when we return to that foundation, distortion falls away. And like Jesus said, the truth will set you free. So please continue to study carefully and test everything by the law and let the covenant truth speak for itself. And so with that, I say shalom.